On Sunday, August 2nd, 2026, retirees gathered simultaneously across the cities of Tehran, Mashhad, Kermanshah, and Shush to denounce severe economic hardship, entrenched corruption, and rapidly dwindling purchasing power. The same day, Iran's own intelligence ministry-affiliated Mehr news agency reported that 3 law enforcement officers had been killed in an armed clash in Shidgan while attempting to carry out an arrest raid. That's not a coincidence of timing. That's the actual daily reality. Iran's leadership is now managing on the ground each and every day. Public economic protests and armed clashes with security forces happening on the exact same calendar day, reported by the regime's own official state media, rather than by any outside source with an obvious interest in exaggerating the severity of the crisis. One day earlier, on August 1st, the state-run website Nabz-e-Gaimat reported that a single tray of 30 eggs had surpassed 850,000 tomans in Tehran, an increase state media itself described as one of the most shocking market events in recent years. Analysts quoted by the state-run Khabar online news site attributed that specific price spike primarily to political uncertainty and what they called a neither war nor peace situation, a phrase that captures something important about exactly where this conflict currently sits. So let's actually walk through in real detail how Iran's leadership ended up trapped this thoroughly and this completely, verified not through Western intelligence assessments or American military press releases, but through Iran's own state-run newspapers, its own official security ministry, and its own official economic data agencies. To understand how deep this crisis actually runs, you need to start with the numbers Iran's own government has been forced to publish. The state-run Economy 24 website, citing the latest inflation data from Iran's Statistical Center for July 2026, reported that the cost of the household livelihood basket had increased by nearly 25% in just the first 4 months of the Iranian calendar year alone, a period beginning in late March. That same report stated plainly that economic pressure on lower and middle-income Iranians had reached what it called a critical breaking point. Digging into the specifics, Economy 24 tracked 53 selected food items and found that 41 of them recorded price increases higher than the official urban inflation rate of 85.2%, meaning the overwhelming majority of everyday grocery items are now becoming more expensive even faster than Iran's already staggering headline inflation number would suggest. Cooking oil, both solid and liquid, mayonnaise, imported rice, chicken, and eggs were specifically singled out as products experiencing what the report called record-breaking price surges. When a regime's own economic press starts describing basic grocery costs using language like record-breaking and critical breaking point, that's not propaganda directed outward at adversaries. That's an admission directed inward at a population the government still has to somehow govern. To fully understand why a single tray of eggs, crossing 850,000 tomans, generated this kind of shocked reaction from Iran's own state media, you have to understand just how far the underlying currency has already fallen. Iran's rial has been in a documented, sustained freefall for well over a year now, trading at levels never before recorded in the country's history. A currency collapse that traces back through decades of accumulated mismanagement compounded by sanctions. The regime has never successfully adapted around, despite years of trying. When a currency loses that much practical value, ordinary price data stops behaving in any kind of predictable, gradual way, and instead starts producing exactly the kind of sudden, shocking price spikes state media is now describing using words like record-breaking. Because merchants pricing goods against a rapidly depreciating currency have to adjust their prices constantly just to avoid taking a loss on every single transaction. That's the specific mechanism connecting an abstract currency statistic to something as immediate and personal as the price of a single carton of eggs in a Tehran market. And it's exactly why economic protests in Iran have consistently traced back to currency and inflation data rather than any single, isolated policy failure. There's a broader dimension to this crisis worth understanding too, one captured directly in recent reporting from inside Iran's own organized resistance movement. That reporting has been remarkably direct in describing the current state of the regime, noting that Iran has been getting pounded by sustained American military pressure, while the naval blockade has been actively crushing the broader economy from the sea simultaneously. According to that same reporting, Iran's leadership, its military, and its economy have all been described as being in shambles at the same time, forcing the regime into increasingly desperate measures, including a documented pattern of public executions specifically deployed as an attempt to hold the population in check through fear rather than through any genuine restoration of order. The central question that report raised, and one worth sitting with carefully, is where exactly the reaction of the Iranian people has actually been throughout all of this compounding pressure. Because the honest answer, based on everything we've just walked through, the Shadigan clash, the Iran Shah checkpoint attack, the simultaneous retiree protests across 4 major cities, is that the reaction has already been building steadily. It's simply been arriving in a scattered, decentralized, and increasingly armed form rather than through the kind of single, unified, headline-grabbing uprising outside observers often expect to see before concluding a regime is genuinely in serious trouble. It's worth pausing on how Iran's own state media has chosen to explain this crisis, because the framing itself tells you something important about how thoroughly the regime's usual excuses have stopped working. For years, Iranian officials have consistently pointed to sanctions, war, and external pressure as the primary drivers of the country's worsening cost of living crisis. But even within Iran's own analytical commentary, that explanation has started breaking down under its own weight, because the mounting evidence, including admissions buried inside state-controlled media itself, increasingly points toward a different underlying reality. Iran's economic collapse isn't a sudden phenomenon triggered purely by this latest war. And it isn't primarily the consequence of recent regional conflict alone. It's the product of decades of political mismanagement, institutionalized corruption, and policies specifically designed to preserve the ruling establishment rather than genuinely improve the lives of ordinary citizens. Official agencies keep publishing statistics on inflation, poverty, and unemployment, but they consistently avoid any serious public examination of the political system that actually produced these numbers in the first place, focusing instead on describing symptoms, while carefully steering clear of any structural diagnosis that might implicate the regime's own governance. This is exactly the environment in which the current military conflict has been unfolding. And it's important to understand that the war didn't create these underlying vulnerabilities. It simply accelerated and compounded conditions that were already pushing Iran toward genuine crisis well before the fighting began. The military dimension of this pressure campaign traces back to February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iranian military targets, an operation that also resulted in the assassination of Iran's supreme leader. That decapitation strike didn't just remove a single individual from power. It introduced a genuine and lasting crisis of command authority at the very top of the regime, one that's continued shaping internal Iranian politics for months afterward. Reports have consistently described the Supreme Leader's successor as remaining largely isolated with limited public engagement since that assassination, with persistent speculation about physical or mental incapacity creating real uncertainty about who actually holds coherent decision-making authority at the regime's apex right now. That's not a minor governance footnote, because a regime facing simultaneous economic collapse and sustained military pressure genuinely needs clear, decisive leadership at the top to manage that kind of compound crisis, and the available evidence suggests Iran currently lacks exactly that. Layer the naval dimension of this conflict on top of that leadership vacuum, and the full scope of the pressure becomes even clearer. According to detailed reporting from inside Iran's own resistance movement, the country has been getting pounded by sustained American military strikes, while a naval blockade has been actively crushing its economy from the sea. That same reporting described Iran's leadership, military, and economy as all being simultaneously in shambles, forcing the regime to resort to public executions, specifically as an attempt to hold its own population in check through fear, rather than through any genuine restoration of order or legitimacy. Think about what that actually represents strategically. A government that's had to escalate to public executions as a domestic control mechanism is a government that's already exhausted its more conventional tools for managing internal dissent, subsidies, propaganda, selective concessions, none of which have proven sufficient against the scale of anger currently building across the country. And that anger has increasingly taken a genuinely violent turn in multiple parts of the country simultaneously, not just the Shadigan clash that opened this entire breakdown. Just days earlier, on Thursday, July 30th, official Iranian state media reported that armed individuals, operating from 3 separate vehicles, opened fire on a police checkpoint in Iranshahr, killing an officer outright. These aren't isolated, disconnected incidents happening in some remote corner of the country. They represent a pattern of armed resistance against state security forces that's now showing up in official government reporting across multiple provinces within the same general window of time. When a regime's own state media starts routinely reporting fatal armed clashes between its security forces and its own population, occurring in different regions within days of each other, that's a genuinely different category of instability than the more familiar pattern of large but largely peaceful street protests Iran has experienced during previous unrest cycles. Analysts studying this specific convergence of pressures have been explicit about why the current moment differs so dramatically from Iran's previous protest cycles in 2009, 2017, 2019, and 2022. Every one of those earlier waves of unrest occurred under comparatively stable external conditions, where the regime could concentrate its full resources on domestic suppression, while still maintaining regional deterrence capability and basic economic functionality elsewhere. The current situation has eliminated nearly all of those stabilizing factors simultaneously, forcing the regime to manage what amounts to existential threats across multiple domains at once, while operating in a condition that's been described as financially depleted, diplomatically isolated, militarily vulnerable, and domestically contested, all layered on top of each other, rather than arriving one at a time, the way Iran's leadership has historically had to manage previous crises. Human rights organizations tracking this crisis from outside Iran have documented the escalating pattern of executions in real detail, describing a regime that's increasingly relying on capital punishment, not as a response to individual criminal cases, but as a deliberate, systemic tool for managing political dissent at scale. Amnesty International's monitoring throughout late July specifically flagged the government's strategy of labeling protesters as enemies of God while simultaneously deploying lethal force against them as evidence of a regime prioritizing raw survival over any genuine attempt at reconciliation with its own population. That kind of designation matters legally and politically within Iran's own judicial framework, because labeling dissent in explicitly religious terms provides the regime with a theological justification for applying its harshest available penalties against protesters who might otherwise be treated as engaging in ordinary civil unrest rather than capital offenses. When outside human rights monitors and Iran's own state media both end up documenting the same underlying pattern of escalating executions, even while describing it through very different framing and language, that convergence itself becomes a form of independent verification because it means this specific piece of the crisis isn't dependent on trusting either side's account in isolation. Let's talk about exactly how the regime has chosen to respond to this compound pressure, because the strategy being deployed right now tells you a great deal about how much genuine room for maneuver actually remains. Government strategies throughout this crisis have specifically included labeling protesters as enemies of God while deploying lethal force against them, an approach that human rights monitoring organizations have documented extensively as this unrest has continued. That kind of framing and tactics suggests a regime that's prioritizing raw survival over any genuine attempt at reconciliation with its own population. A pattern that's genuinely characteristic of what political scientists describe as theo-security states, governments that rely fundamentally on coercion rather than public consent to maintain their grip on power. Those tactics can absolutely suppress immediate mobilization in the short term, forcing protesters off the streets through fear of lethal consequences, but they simultaneously risk eroding the regime's longer-term legitimacy even further while actively increasing the underlying resistance building beneath the surface, a dynamic that tends to produce exactly the kind of violent, decentralized clashes now showing up in incidents like the ones in Shadigan and Iranshah, rather than large, organized, and comparatively manageable street demonstrations. Let's talk about the military dimension underneath all of this economic and political turmoil, because the war itself hasn't actually stopped. It's simply settled into a pattern that's stopped generating the kind of dramatic, headline-grabbing strikes that defined its earliest weeks while continuing to grind away at Iran's remaining capacity in the background. The conflict that began with those coordinated February strikes has continued through what American military planners designated Operation Epic Fury, a sustained campaign that's methodically worked through Iran's coastal missile installations, its naval assets, its command infrastructure, and its underground storage facilities over the following months. That sustained military pressure runs in direct parallel with the naval blockade responsible for crushing Iran's ability to generate foreign currency through oil exports. And it's worth understanding that these two forms of pressure, military strikes and economic strangulation, aren't operating independently of each other. They're reinforcing one another in ways that compound the overall damage far beyond what either pressure campaign could achieve on its own. Every missile depot destroyed reduces Iran's capacity to credibly threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which in turn makes the blockade easier to enforce and harder for Iran to circumvent, which in turn deepens the currency collapse and inflation crisis playing out in Tehran's grocery markets, which in turn fuels exactly the kind of protests and armed clashes now showing up in Iran's own state media on a near-weekly basis. That interconnected cycle is genuinely important to understand, because it explains why this crisis has continued deepening even during periods when the war itself has appeared to quiet down from the outside. A casual observer scanning headlines might reasonably conclude that a war generating fewer dramatic strike announcements has entered some kind of lull or stalemate, but the underlying economic damage from months of sustained military pressure and naval blockade doesn't simply pause just because the pace of individual strikes slows down. It continues compounding in the background, showing up weeks and months later in exactly the kind of inflation data, currency collapse figures, and grocery price spikes we've been walking through. That's precisely the neither war nor peace situation Iran's own state-run Khabar Online specifically cited when explaining this month's inflation surge. A genuinely accurate description of a conflict that stopped producing dramatic daily headlines while continuing to inflict serious, compounding damage on the ground in ways that are increasingly difficult for the regime to hide or explain away. There's a deeper structural reason why sanctions and military pressure have hit Iran's economy so much harder this time than in previous rounds of confrontation. And it comes down to how the regime itself has spent decades adapting to external pressure rather than genuinely reforming around it. Iran's economic crisis isn't merely the product of sanctions in some simple, direct sense. It's the product of how those sanctions have been domesticated by the regime over time. Decades of external pressure have entrenched what analysts describe as a militarized rentier economy, one dominated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and various parastatal conglomerates operating through smuggling networks, monopolistic control over key sectors, and deliberately opaque financial channels specifically designed to circumvent international restrictions. That kind of sanctioned rentierism might allow specific regime-connected networks to continue extracting wealth even under heavy sanctions, but it comes at an enormous structural cost, undermining genuine productive investment across the broader economy, dramatically exacerbating inequality between regime-connected elites and ordinary citizens, and steadily eroding the government's overall fiscal capacity to actually function as a normal state. As oil revenues continue declining under the combined weight of sanctions and blockade, and as inflation continues accelerating the way this month's egg and cooking oil price data clearly demonstrates, the regime's traditional distributive mechanisms, the subsidies, the patronage networks, the systems that have historically kept key constituencies loyal, are increasingly collapsing under their own weight, severing the material basis of loyalty that's helped sustain this government through previous crises. That collapsing patronage system connects directly to one of the more fascinating and underappreciated dynamics running through this entire crisis, the role of Iran's exiled opposition figures, and specifically Reza Pahlavi, the son of Iran's last Shah before the 1979 revolution. Analysis from inside Iran's own organized resistance movement has been notably blunt in describing Pahlavi's actual impact on this unfolding crisis, characterizing him essentially as a political gift to the regime he claims to oppose, a figure whose record consists not of decisive leadership, but of what's been described as serial contradiction. Someone who absorbs opposition energy, fragments it across competing factions and priorities, and ultimately returns very little in the way of concrete, organized pressure against the government he's positioned himself as an alternative to. Pahlavi has repeatedly urged Iranian protesters to remain patient and stay home until he personally issues what he's described as his final call for action, rather than encouraging the kind of immediate, sustained uprising the current economic desperation would seem to demand. That specific dynamic, an organized opposition movement in exile choosing strategic caution over encouraging immediate confrontation, while the domestic population inside Iran increasingly resorts to spontaneous, decentralized, and sometimes armed resistance entirely independent of any coordinated leadership, adds yet another layer of genuine uncertainty to how this entire crisis actually resolves, because it means the pressure building against this regime currently lacks any single unifying political leadership capable of actually translating widespread anger into a coordinated, decisive challenge to the government's authority. There's a specific institutional dynamic worth understanding here too, because Iran's bizarre merchant class has historically functioned as one of the regime's more reliable, if occasionally contentious, economic partners, a relationship stretching back well before the 1979 revolution itself. When merchants in Tehran's Grand Bazaar closed their shops and went on strike over currency policy last winter, that wasn't just another economic protest among many. It represented a genuine rupture in one of the regime's longest-standing internal economic relationships, one that's historically provided a degree of stability and predictability, even during periods of broader political unrest. If that same merchant class were to fully mobilize behind organized opposition, rather than limiting itself to narrower, sector-specific economic grievances, exactly the kind of full bazaar mobilization scenario analysts have identified as a key marker of the fragmentation pathway, that would represent a genuinely significant escalation beyond anything the regime has faced during previous protest cycles, because it would mean losing the tacit cooperation of an economic constituency the government has relied on for legitimacy and stability for nearly half a century. Provincial security dynamics matter enormously here too, because incidents like the armed clash in Shadigan and the checkpoint attack in Iranshar aren't occurring in Iran's most tightly controlled urban centers. They're happening in regions with their own distinct ethnic, tribal, and historical relationships with the central government in Tehran. Iran's Kurdish and Baluch populations in particular have long-standing grievances with the central government that predate this current crisis by decades, and any sustained weakening of central security control in those specific regions carries the added risk of feeding into genuine separatist sentiment rather than simply representing another data point in a broader, undifferentiated nationwide protest movement. That's precisely why serious regional stability analysis treats provincial fragmentation as a distinct and genuinely plausible pathway, rather than folding it into the same broad category as urban economic protests in Tehran. Because the underlying political dynamics driving unrest in a place like Iran-Shah are meaningfully different from the dynamics driving retirees onto the streets of Tehran over grocery prices, even though both ultimately trace back to the same underlying convergence of economic collapse, military pressure, and eroding central authority. One political analyst tracking this specific dynamic described the emerging situation in particularly stark terms, arguing that Iran is being driven by what she called absolute economic desperation, fueled by the glaring vulnerabilities of an increasingly fractured governing elite, positioning the country for what she characterized as a decisive confrontation for the Iranian people, one that could unfold rapidly given how quickly conditions have been deteriorating across multiple fronts simultaneously. Another regional analyst, describing the broader crisis in similarly direct language, characterized Iran as being engulfed in a severe socioeconomic crisis, driven by what she called geopolitical adventurism, systemic mismanagement, and runaway hyperinflation, language that would sound like harsh external criticism if it weren't largely echoing assessments already circulating within Iran's own state-affiliated commentary and analysis. So let's actually walk through what genuine paths forward remain available to this regime, because understanding exactly why the word trapped applies here requires looking honestly at each option Iran's leadership might theoretically pursue and understanding why each one keeps running into the same fundamental wall. Analysts studying Iran's possible trajectories through the remainder of this decade have generally laid out several distinct scenarios worth walking through individually. The first scenario involves the regime successfully reasserting control through continued escalating repression, deploying the besieged militia to maintain local control, augmented by direct IRGC deployment and potentially even foreign militia support, specifically designed to crush ongoing protests through overwhelming force, mass arrests, show trials, and systematic executions intended to restore deterrence through sheer terror rather than through any genuine restoration of legitimacy or public trust. That particular outcome, while technically preserving the Islamic Republic's formal continuity on paper, would almost certainly accelerate the country's international isolation even further, intensify existing sanctions pressure, and deepen the underlying economic decay this entire crisis has been built around, all while embedding a kind of structural instability that would require permanently mobilizing the regime's coercive security apparatus indefinitely just to maintain even a fragile artificial sense of order. The second broad scenario involves genuine fragmentation, a considerably more severe outcome that would involve security forces either hesitating or actively defecting in key provinces, protest activity expanding into constituencies that have historically remained loyal to the regime, the bizarre merchant class fully mobilizing behind organized opposition, rather than the more limited sector-specific strikes seen in previous economic protests, and the regime ultimately losing meaningful territorial control over multiple cities, forcing either genuinely emergency political measures or outright collapse of central authority in those specific regions. That's a genuinely severe outcome, and it's worth being honest that it remains far from guaranteed, given how much coercive capability the regime still retains, even in its current weakened state. But the fact that serious regional security analysis treats this as a plausible near-term scenario, rather than a purely theoretical worst case, tells you something important about just how much the underlying conditions have shifted compared to any previous point in this regime's nearly half-century history. A third, arguably more likely near-term outcome looks something closer to a prolonged, grinding stalemate, continued protest mobilization, and scattered armed resistance that never quite achieves a full, coordinated revolutionary breakthrough, while the regime somehow manages to maintain its grip over Tehran and its core institutional apparatus, even as its actual authority over more peripheral regions of the country continues steadily eroding week after week. That specific scenario would likely produce exactly the pattern we're already starting to see play out in real time: weeks, or potentially months, of violent equilibrium marked by continued high casualty rates from scattered armed clashes like the ones reported in Shaydagan and Iran-Shah, ongoing economic paralysis reflected in exactly the kind of runaway grocery price data coming out of Tehran right now, and a mutual, grinding exhaustion on both sides of this confrontation, without any single, clear, decisive moment of resolution arriving anytime soon. There's one more thread worth weaving into this picture, because it connects the current economic and political crisis back to the single most dangerous asset Iran's regime still technically possesses, even in the middle of this compounding collapse: its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Even as nearly every other pillar supporting this government has eroded throughout this war, its currency, its regional proxy network, its command structure at the very top, its basic domestic legitimacy, Iran's leadership has continued treating that specific stockpile as one of its last remaining sources of genuine strategic leverage. International inspectors have been unable to independently verify the location or condition of that material for months, with reports indicating it may be sitting somewhere beneath rubble, sealed tunnels, or newly constructed facilities that American officials continue debating whether to strike directly or attempt to physically secure through a ground operation. That single unresolved thread captures something important about the broader pattern running through this entire crisis, a regime that's been systematically stripped of nearly every conventional advantage it once possessed, military, economic, and diplomatic, all at once, while still clinging to one final genuinely dangerous card, specifically because it represents the one piece of leverage that hasn't yet been fully neutralized or removed from the equation entirely. That's not a comforting detail to end on, because it means even a regime this thoroughly trapped on every other front retains at least one remaining lever capable of dramatically raising the stakes of this entire conflict if its leadership ever concludes it has genuinely nothing left to lose. What makes this specific moment genuinely different from Iran's prior brushes with serious internal unrest is the sheer simultaneity of everything converging at once, rather than arriving in the kind of sequential, manageable waves the regime has successfully navigated in the past. A government facing pure economic hardship alone can often buy itself time through targeted subsidies, currency interventions, or selective political concessions. A government facing pure military pressure alone can often rally at least some portion of its population around nationalist sentiment and resistance to foreign aggression. A government facing pure diplomatic isolation alone can often pivot toward alternative economic and security partnerships to offset that isolation. But a government facing genuine, severe versions of all three simultaneously, a leadership vacuum at the very top following an assassination, a naval blockade actively crushing its ability to generate foreign currency, inflation running above 85% alongside grocery prices, state media itself is calling record-breaking, and a domestic population increasingly resorting to armed resistance against its own security forces in multiple regions at once, has genuinely limited tools left available to manage any single one of those crises without making at least one of the others meaningfully worse in the process. That's ultimately what justifies describing this regime as trapped, rather than simply describing it as facing a difficult period the way it has periodically throughout its nearly half-century history. Every lever this government might normally pull to relieve pressure on one front actively worsens pressure somewhere else. Escalating repression to control the streets requires diverting scarce economic resources towards security forces at the exact moment the population desperately needs those resources directed toward basic economic relief instead. Seeking any kind of external diplomatic or economic lifeline requires making concessions that risk being perceived internally as weakness precisely when the regime most needs to project strength and control to its own restless population. Continuing military resistance against sustained American pressure requires resources and attention that could otherwise go towards stabilizing an economy already in genuine freefall according to the regime's own state-run economic press. There simply isn't a clean, uncontested move remaining on the board that doesn't come with a serious cost attached somewhere else in this compounding crisis. If this breakdown helped you understand just how deeply this crisis actually runs, verified through Iran's own state media rather than through any outside propaganda or speculation, go ahead and drop a like, because pulling together data from Iran's own economic press, its own security ministry reporting, and independent regional analysis into one coherent picture takes real effort in a story evolving this quickly across so many different fronts simultaneously. Let me know in the comments which of these outcomes, sustained repression, genuine fragmentation, or prolonged grinding stalemate, you think is actually most likely to define how this crisis eventually resolves in the months and years ahead, given everything we've just walked through. Subscribe if you want to keep following this story closely and in real detail, because between the escalating armed clashes, the runaway grocery prices, the ongoing naval blockade, and a leadership structure that's been described as isolated and possibly incapacitated, since the earliest days of this war, this is exactly the kind of rapidly evolving, multi-front crisis capable of producing a major, headline-defining development with very little advance warning to anyone watching from the outside. And share this with anyone who's still only hearing the isolated pieces of this story, a protest here, an armed clash there, a currency collapsing somewhere else, without realizing just how directly all of these threads connect into one single coordinated picture of a government that's genuinely run out of room to maneuver on every single front simultaneously, with no clean, uncontested option remaining anywhere on the board. Thanks for watching, and we'll be right here the moment this situation develops any further, continuing to track every one of these threads as they keep converging on a government with fewer and fewer genuine options left.